Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in Genesis chapter 17, and God is going to begin to put things together for the instituting of the covenant with Abraham. And one of the things he's going to do is Abraham, as a sign of the covenant, you got to get circumcised. And circumcision is a very painful procedure where the foreskin of the male genitalia is cut off. Now this becomes very interesting because I'll answer the question later and down towards the end of the chapter. Do we have to get circumcised today? Okay, but let's start with what God instituted. Verse 1 says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him, saying, I am God Almighty, live in my presence and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you greatly. The term blameless should be taken in the context of Abraham walking in faith in the covenant. The one thing we've seen with Abraham, and we will see with all of the men that God chose them, that the one thing they did was always completed what God had given them to do. But that didn't mean that they were perfect individuals. So that's not what he's saying. In other words, when he says blameless, and I'll give you a quick kind of illustration of this. Abraham was going to, as soon as God is finished, he's going to circumcise every male in his household. We'll get to that later, in a moment. When we get to the book of Exodus, we will find that in the context of defining blameless, Moses wasn't blameless. And when God appeared to Moses and told Moses to go back to Pharaoh, on the way, okay, the Bible said the angel of the Lord sought to kill Moses. Why? Because his sons wasn't circumcised. And his wife Zipporah immediately circumcised him and then threw the foreskin of her son's genitalia at Moses and said, you are a husband of blood to me. So that would be an example. In other words, Abraham was always faithful to do what God had commanded him. Verse 3. Then Abraham fell face down, and God spoke with him. As for me, my covenant is with you. You will become the father of many nations. Kind of interesting, I think. Notice he said many nations, not just one nation, but many nations. Your name will no longer be Abram, but your name will be Abraham. Now, I have to say I'm glad, because I kept, up until this time, from Genesis chapter 12 to here, I kept referring to him as Abraham, and not, his real name was Abram, and now God is changing it to Abraham. Okay, so verse 5 again, you will no longer be Abram, but your name will be Abraham, for I will make you the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful, and will make nations and kings come from you. I will keep my covenant between me and you and your future offsprings throughout their generations as an everlasting covenant, to be your God and the God of your offsprings after you. Verse 8, and to you and your future offspring I will give the land where you are residing, all the land of Canaan, as an eternal possession, and I will be their God. So God is kind of renewing what he's promised to Abraham. Verse 9, and God said to Abraham, as for you and your offspring after you throughout their generations are to keep my covenant. This is my covenant, which you are to keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every one of your males must be circumcised. You must circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, that's the male penis, to serve as a sign of the covenant between me and you. So this covenant, this is why he instituted this. This will later be incorporated into the law of Moses for the Israelites. So keep that in mind. So again, the question would be, do we have to, as a sign of a covenant, be circumcised today? All right, we'll come back to that. Verse 12, throughout your generations, every male among you at 8 days old, is to be circumcised. This includes the slave born in your house, and one purchased with money from any foreigner, and the one who is not your offspring. Verse 13, a slave born in your house, as well as one purchased with money, must be circumcised. My covenant will be the mark in your flesh as an everlasting covenant. If any male is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that man will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So this again, we're going to see this, he's going to circumcise. That when you are an adult, it is extremely painful for this. So the best time is to do it 8 days after birth. Hospitals still do it today. And notice he said everyone associated with you. The slave. If a person is purchased as a slave, if they come into your house, they ought to be circumcised. If a person later on, we will see in the sense of a proselyte, one who the defects to the faith of Israelites, one who comes into the fold, he embraces the God of Israel. He was under obligation to be circumcised. Okay. And then it is a sign, a physical sign of the covenant. That's what it is. Much like water baptism in the New Testament, is a physical sign of salvation. Under the Old Testament, circumcision is a physical sign, okay, of the covenant between Abraham and his offspring. Okay, verse 15. God said to Abraham, as for your wife Sarai, do not call her Sarai, but for Sarah will be her name. I will bless her. Indeed, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will produce nations. Kings of people will come from her. Look at verse 17. Abraham fell face down, then he laughed, and then he said to himself, can a child be born to a 100-year-old man? Can Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, give birth? So Abraham said to God, now I'll come back to this statement here in a moment, but we kind of see here God now saying to Abraham that the promised child will come between Abraham and Sarah. Now her name, she's just as much as a covenant. So let me just say this, because we saw in the last chapter when they decided to try to have a child through the slave Hagar. And by the way, she's still around, and Ishmael is growing too now. So Ishmael at this point is around 13 years old. maybe 12, turning and going into this 13 years, okay? That means Hagar is still there as the slave, probably being salty, right? Because she had to submit back. Remember, the angel told her to go back and submit to her mistreatment. Okay, not going to be good for you. Even though she kind of brought it on herself by kind of getting a little haughty because Abraham had gotten her pregnant. She, no, you're still a slave. As I said, that's going to change. We'll get into that later. And she's really going to be actually freed and be more than a slave. But we'll see that later. Let's see. Let me go back. I wanted to read this. And this statement in verse 17, when it says that Abraham laughed, I want you to kind of remember that. Because Sarah's going to laugh too. And there's a difference because the same word, one laughs out of rejoicing, the other one laughs out of doubt. But we'll get to that later. Verse 18, so Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael was accepted to you. Now he's thinking about his son, Ishmael. No matter how he came, he's still his son, still flesh and blood. Verse 19, but God says, no, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. I will confirm my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his future offspring. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will certainly bless him. I will make him a fruitful and will multiply him greatly. He will father 12 tribal leaders, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will confirm my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. And when he finished talking with him, God withdrew from Abraham. So as I spent a little time talking about this last time, that the seed, the descendants of Israel, are not, I don't know if anyone has ever said or connected that they are Muslims, right? This is kind of the thing that people have. Muslims say it, but they don't say it. And by the way, if you think about this too, we're going to see this in just a moment. Do Muslims believe in circumcision? And if they believe in circumcision, I don't know if Muslims believe in circumcision. That's why I'm asking. But if they believe in circumcision, remember that circumcision is tied to Abraham, which is tied to Isaac, the promise, Isaac, the covenant with Isaac. Ishmael is being blessed because he is Abraham's son. But understand the covenant and the promise. Ishmael has nothing to do with that, and God is making that extremely clear. Okay. All right. So, verse 23 is that then Abraham took his son Ishmael and all of the slaves born in his house or purchased with this money, every male among the members of Abraham's household, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskin on that very day, just as God had said to him. And this, we will see, was always the mark of Abraham, his obedience. Notice, that very day, he did not linger, he did not make excuses. He was always faithful to do what God had commanded him. And that's a mark of greatness for him. He always obeyed God immediately and perfectly. Okay, keep that in mind. Perfectly. So verse 24, Abraham was 99 years old when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. Ouch. 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 Okay. Keep this in mind that, remember, Abraham was 75 years old when God first appeared to him. So in chapter 12, he was 75 years old. Sarah was 65. Abraham is now 99, Sarah is now 90. Okay. Verse 24 again, Abraham was 99 years old when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. And his son Ishmael was 13 years old when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. On that same day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his household, both slaves born in his house and those purchased with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. Excuse me. So again, Abraham was faithful to keep the commandments of God. Now, here is the question of the day, because many circumcise the males today in America, especially. I was circumcised only because people feel it's the Christian thing to do, it's the biblical thing to do. So, should we circumcise today? Right? In other words, there's still males being born. Now, I'm thankful that I was circumcised when I was born. Okay? But do you have to fulfill? In other words, if you become a Christian, do you have to get circumcised? Ouch, again, because it would be painful. Later we're going to see just how painful that can be, because it will cost some people their lives. Abraham's sons, after his daughter is raped, would get vengeance on the people that raped his daughter by telling them that, well, if you get circumcised, we can be brothers and stuff. And when they were circumcised, they were weakened. It was like they were in pain for like 3 days. And Jacob's son went and slaughtered them. So this is when you're older, well, even when you're young, it's painful. I'm just glad I don't remember it. It's painful whatever age. I think the best medical time, as well as when God says 8 days old, it's still painful. So the question is, do you have to today? And let me just say this, there is no New Testament command to circumcise or to be circumcised as a sign of the covenant. There's no sign for it. So you're neither the better or the worse. And if you want to make the arguments, and people make the arguments on both sides, I've heard both arguments where circumcision is better, uncircumcision is better. Okay. But it is not, God is not saying to you, you must do this. If you get circumcised, it means absolutely nothing. That's my point. You just got circumcised. Now, some people think they're getting circumcised because it's a biblical thing. It's not. So whether you get circumcised or whether you don't get circumcised, your choice, but it means nothing. In other words, it's not a biblical thing. You're not adding to the biblical covenant or anything like that. No, it means absolutely nothing today. God has not commanded. So it's your choice. All right, guys. Chapter 18 in the next study. I'll see you then.